Welcome to Medieval Germanica. I am your host, Brandon Foster. Today's podcast is Who Were the Germans? Before this episode is over, you will have learned where they came from, what language the Germans spoke, and a little bit about what they looked like, at least as much as we know. Now, let's dive in. So, up first, where did they come from? So we know that the group that we call the Germans started in somewhere around the North and Baltic Oceans. Or seas, not oceans. Now, we know they came from somewhere in southern Norway, Sweden area, the entire area of Denmark, and then what is today northern Germany, that whole kind of collective. Now, we know that they started migrating to the Rhine, which is between what is at that time was called Gaul or Germania. So Gaul was where France is today, and it included places like Aquitaine, and it also had places like where Switzerland is as well. So that was all of Gaul. Also, the Rhine separated then where Germania was, which was the northern eastern side. So if you know where the Rhine River goes, it separates, or the northern section that goes into the North Sea is kind of the divider. Anything on the west was Gaul, anything on the east was Germania. So Gaul, during the early centuries, the B.C. and A.D. centuries, they was mostly comprised of Celtic tribes. And they were contesting with the Romans for a long time. We know about this from Julius Caesar's writings and other historians and generals during that time. So the Germans start coming in, and they mostly contest with the Gauls. And then, during the first century, we are told that they start interacting with Julius Caesar. This is one of the first writings we get of the Germans. Now, it's not really until the 1st and 2nd century AD, or CE, as some people call it today, where the German tribes start actually infiltrating into Roman territory. Up until then, it was primarily just the Gauls and the Germans fighting, going back and forth across the Rhine, or the Romans coming in and attacking and doing war in Gaul. We hear a little bit under Julius Caesar that he invaded slightly over the Rhine, but he didn't go very far. The Rhine was always the boundary. And this had to do with lots of different logistics and lots of different things at that time. Now, the end of the Germanic migration of them going from around the North Sea and coming south happened between 300 and 600 AD, or again CE. And this is what we call the migration period. Now, historians call this a migration period because of the mass migration of Germans coming into Gaul and eventually into Italy, the Iberian Peninsula, and even some, like the Visigoths, they go even into Africa, and they start a African nation in North Africa, Iberia. The Lombards go into Italy, the Franks go into Aquitaine and Gaul. Tons of different groups go all over the place. And the middle of this 3-century period is the fall of the Roman Empire in 476. And some historians, especially those in previous decades, previous eras of historical study, believe that it was the Germans that caused the fall of Rome. They said this, the Germans coming in, the migrating, them, the barbaric invasion, as they called it, was the cause. Now historians just say it was a cause. They were definitely a portion of the fall of Rome, but a lot of it had to do also with internal issues and many other problems. But it wasn't just the Germans coming in. They definitely added to it. They sacked Rome a few times, but they were just a portion of the pie of Rome falling. So this was where they come from and kind of them coming down and becoming part of the Mediterranean story. Now they're in Central Europe, and they would always be, the Germans have always been a Central Europe collective. Some did, again, go to Iberian, but they morphed more into the Latin version than they did with the Germanic. Now, what language did they speak? This is another very important thing for early Germanic historians like myself. Well, we know of 3 different variations of the Germanic language, the language that is, spoken today, or, the early version of it. So we have the Weser Rhine Germanic, and this was also called Isvianic. That was the Latin German name for it. And it comes from 3 different brothers that were born to the first man. That was a German legend. I'll talk about that in a different episode. Now, in Weser Rhine Germanic, this is where we get the Frisian language, Bavarian, Alemanni, Sicambri, different tribes that spoke this Weser Rhine Germanic. Different tribes that spoke the Weser Rhine Germanic. Now, it's called Weser Rhine because of its location. Again, this is the Rhine River. This is the Weser Rhine area, so that's where they lived. This is where we also find the Franks, the Angles, and stuff like that. They would speak a slightly different, and then that version, which is called Northern Germanic, would become English. So Northern Germanic, or Ingvaeonic, is where we get the Cimbri, the Teutonic, Saxon, Angle, and Chauci languages. And there's others. These are just some of the biggest ones, and therefore that's why I'm going to mention them. So Northern Germanic, again, is Angle, and the Angles, and the Saxon Angles, they're the ones that went to England. Angle, England. And so English is a Northern Germanic variation of Germanic. Now the last one is Eastern Germanic, or Irmionic, and this is where we get the Swabi Confederation, which is like Swabia today, and the Ermenduri, Cadi, and Chersuski, if I'm saying that correctly. I may be saying all these incorrectly, but I'm doing my best. I read a lot of these names. I don't always pronounce them, so I'm still learning how to say them out loud. So we have Weser Rhine Germanic, Northern Germanic, and Eastern Germanic. These are the 3 languages. Now, again, there's many other different versions of these languages, lots of other different tribes. And again, we have other different groups. The German language, or Germanic, comes from the Indo-European language group. This is one of the largest language families that we have kind of mapped out. There's other different families. You have families in Asia, you have families in Africa, other different groups have them, but the Indo-European is an incredibly large family group. So this encompasses German, which again, the Germanic languages is where you can find, again, English and German today. You have the Romantic languages, which come from Latin, and some of them are mixed of Latin and Germanic, and that's where you get French and Spanish. You also have other ones that are even farther than those two, like the Hittites. The Hittites were a Indo-European people. They were one of the first that we chronicle in history. They have the Hittite Empire in the Middle East, and so, but they're still a Indo-European language group. And it even goes all the way out to the Aryans that conquered in India, the group that went to India and created what we call the Indian culture today, with them mixing with the local indigenous populations. They were a Indo-European people. So Indo-European is an incredibly broad language. And while we're just focusing primarily today on the German and the Germanic family members, I guess, it is good to know that this is an incredibly large family group. And then also going back again to the Germanic, the Northern Germanic is where we also find the modern Scandinavian languages. So they are still included in their Germanic family. Now, the last thing I want to talk about with the remainder of my time is what they look like. We don't know a lot about, based off of primary written sources. And when it comes to the way someone looks, there's not really a lot to even say. And a lot of this we can, add up to with archaeology. So the things we do know come from Tacitus. And he wrote a book called Germania. And he wrote this in the later 1st century. And it is back and forth with historians whether he actually went to Germania and he saw them himself. He met the German people himself. Or he is basing it off of other people who had gone there, soldiers and merchants. And even within the Roman army, there were Germanic soldiers, warriors, who had joined the Roman army so that they could gain more prestige. It was very, the Germanic tribes were very warlike, so they enjoyed war very much. Is very important to them. And if in their particular area war had died down, it was better to go join the Roman army and gain glory that way and then come home than it was just to stay home and have no glory from war at all. So there's multiple different ways he could have seen the Germanic peoples and what they were like. But what we are told is that they had blonde hair, blue eyes, red hair, and they had large frames. And this makes sense based off of what we know with climate, what we have with archaeology, and even to this day. If you go to the Scandinavian areas, if you go to Germany, you see a lot of blue-eyed, blonde hair, red hair, and they're known to be larger people. And some of this also goes with the Gauls. So if you went to Gaul and the Celtic people that lived there, they also had some of these features. I think they had darker hair, but the large frames you definitely would still see with Gaul and even with other groups like the Scots in England. The Scots were known for being very large people. And we can see this even still today. The example I always like to use is my family. My dad's side of the family are both German and Scottish. And my dad is 6'1", my brother is 6 foot, and I'm 6'4". So when the American average is 5'10", and that varies across the globe, going up and down depending on what culture you're around, most of them, that is still very tall. 6'4" is still on the upper end of height. 6 foot and 6'1" is still well above the 5'10" average. And thinking back then, the average height of a Roman would have been around 5'5" around the turn of the 1st century. So if we imagine a male soldier who's about 5'5", that's the average, so it goes up and down, meeting a German, and let's say even if they're 5'10", which is today's average, that's still about 5 inches taller than a Roman. That would have been huge. And if we take, my height, which would have been very much out of the ordinary, but still possible in the 8th and 9th century, we are told by Einhard that Emperor Charlemagne, he was tall, and we believe he was, I think, somewhere around 6 to 6'2", I think is what, if I remember correctly. So he was definitely taller, and there would have been a whole lot of difference when it comes to food and stuff and how well they would have been able to grow. Things would have been about the same between the 8th and 9th century and the 1st century. So we could imagine that some of the warriors in the Germanic armies and their men could have been up to 6 foot or plus. And that is incredibly tall. We're now saying about 7 inches taller than a person who's 5'5". So it is very possible that their large frames was somewhere still in that category. Now, red and blonde hair, we know this because of the weather. Again, if you go to more cold climates, then you need lighter skin, lighter hair, lighter eyes because there's clouds all the time. You don't want blue eyes when you're out on the Sahara Desert or out in the Middle East. You want dark hair. You want dark eyes. That way you can see. So they developed these things because of their climate. So that makes a lot of sense. So archaeology, we have discovered bodies. We've been able to get hair fragments. We can see their heights and graves and everything. Now, some of their graves we don't see until centuries later because it was still the custom to burn your dead up until they became Christianized. Then burying the dead became more popular. But we can still see that in those general areas that these physical characteristics were still the case. So, now that we have talked about where the Germans come from, what language the Germans spoke, or the different variations of their languages and the tribes that spoke those different versions, and what they looked like, you now know a clearer picture of what ancient Germans would have been like. And that is the point of this whole podcast. So if you like what you hear, think this is interesting, all the general stuff, please like, share, comment, and do anything else you can think of. I really appreciate you listening. Have a wonderful day.